They were gone for 100 years. And then, one morning in May, they were back. 28 American bison, loaded onto a cargo plane, flown into a remote valley in Montana where not a single one had set foot since the early 1900s. No fanfare, no ceremony. Just a gate swinging open and the sound of hooves hitting ground that had forgotten what they felt like. What happened in the months that followed surprised even the scientists who organized it. This is the story of how a dead landscape learned to breathe again, and why the people who watched it happen say they'll never look at a field the same way. 100 years ago, the American bison was closer to extinction than most people realize. In the 1880s, an estimated 30 to 60 million of them moved across the Great Plains in herds so dense they darkened the horizon. By 1889, fewer than 1,000 remained. Hunters had taken most of them. Policy had taken the rest. The animals that survived existed in scattered captive groups, held in zoos and private ranches, waiting for a world that wasn't sure it wanted them back. The valley they were flown into sits in the Blackfeet Nation territory in northern Montana, edged against the Rocky Mountain front. It's not a small place. It stretches across tens of thousands of acres of native grassland, the kind of landscape that looks empty until you start paying attention. For a century, it had been grazed by cattle, crossed by fences, and managed the way you manage a resource, carefully, deliberately, and with the assumption that humans needed to stay in control. The Blackfeet people had a different memory of it. Their oral history carries descriptions of bison in that valley, of a relationship between the land and the animal that shaped everything from the grass beneath your feet to the birds overhead. That relationship had been severed in the 1880s, and the land, without the bison, had slowly flattened into something quieter and simpler than it used to be. The project to bring them back started not with a government program, but with a conversation. Members of the Blackfeet Nation, alongside conservation organizations, began asking a question that sounds obvious, but isn't. What would happen if we just put them back? The answer required years of planning, land surveys, genetic testing to find animals whose lineage traced back to the original wild herds, not crossbred with cattle, fencing assessments, predator evaluations, water source mapping. The kind of preparation that makes the actual moment a cargo plane touching down in May feel almost anticlimactic after all that groundwork. Almost. If a story like this gives you hope, comment the word hope so we know you're watching. The 28 bison that arrived were not a random selection. They came primarily from Elk Island National Park in Canada, one of the few places in North America where a genetically distinct wild bison population had been carefully maintained since the early 20th century. These animals carried something irreplaceable in their DNA, a direct link to the herds that had shaped this continent for 10,000 years. When the gate opened and the first animals stepped out, the researchers watching from a distance expected a period of adjustment. Animals relocated to a new environment typically spend days or weeks exploring cautiously, staying close together, testing the edges of their new territory before moving deeper into it. These bison walked out and started grazing within minutes. The scientists wrote it down, exchanged glances, and said very little. There wasn't much to say. The animals moved as though they recognized the ground beneath them, as though some instruction built into them over thousands of generations had simply switched on. What came next is where the story gets genuinely strange. In the months following Reintroduction, researchers began documenting changes in the grassland that shouldn't have been possible so quickly. Bison are not gentle grazers. They don't move through a landscape the way cattle do, cropping evenly from one end to the other. They graze in concentrated bursts, then move on. They roll in the dirt, creating shallow depressions called wallows that fill with rainwater and become microhabitats. Their hooves break up the hard crust of compacted soil, allowing moisture and seeds to penetrate. Their waste fertilizes. Their movement patterns, unpredictable and wide-ranging, allow grazed areas to recover before they return. All of this is known. Ecologists had theorized it for decades. But theory and observation are different things, and what the team found in that Montana valley compressed the expected timeline by years. Within the first season, plant diversity in heavily grazed zones began increasing. Species that hadn't been documented in the valley for decades started reappearing grasses, forbs, flowering plants adapted to a bison-managed landscape. The wallows, even small ones, began attracting waterfowl. Insects returned to areas where they'd been absent. And perhaps most visibly, birds of prey were spotted hunting over sections of the valley where the bison had recently passed, drawn by the insects and small mammals disturbed by the herd's movement. None of this happened because humans engineered it. It happened because the relationship between the bison and the land, interrupted for a century, had resumed. The lead ecologist on the project described it this way: removing a keystone species from an ecosystem is like pulling a structural beam from a building. Everything else adjusts to compensate, but the building is never as strong. Put the beam back and the structure begins to remember what it was built to do. That word remember kept appearing in the field notes. The Blackfeet Nation members who had advocated longest for the reintroduction weren't surprised by any of it. They had said from the beginning that the land needed the bison and the bison needed the land, and that the separation had been an injury, not a transition. What the data confirmed in tables and species counts, they had known through a different kind of record keeping. By the end of the first full year, the herd had grown. Bison calves born on the land, the first wild-born bison in that valley in over 100 years, were documented moving with the herd across territory. Their species hadn't touched in living memory. Researchers photographed them and noted the date carefully. Some of the team, by their own account, didn't say much for a while after. The data was undeniable. There are now efforts modeled on this project in at least 4 other states. Organizations across the Great Plains are working with tribal nations to identify land where bison can be returned, where the genetic diversity of the original herds can be rebuilt, where the grassland ecosystem that once covered a quarter of the North American continent can begin, slowly, to come back to itself. This is not a small ambition, and it will not happen fast. Ecology moves on its own clock, not ours. But the Montana Valley offers something rare in conservation: proof that the clock can start again. That 100 years of absence doesn't have to mean permanent loss. That if you return what was taken, if you step back and let the relationship resume, things begin to move in ways that exceed what anyone planned for. The 28 bison that flew in that May morning are now part of a herd. The valley they landed in is louder than it was with insects, with birds, with the low resonant sound of animals that belong there doing what they were built to do. The scientists are still watching. The Blackfeet Nation is still watching. And the land, by every measure available to us, is answering. There's a lesson buried in that Montana grassland that goes beyond bison and ecology. It's about what happens when you stop treating recovery as a fantasy and start treating it as a project. When you take the long view, gather the people who carry the knowledge, do the preparation no one applauds, and then open the gate, sometimes what comes back doesn't just survive, it transforms the ground it walks on. If you believe nature still has a chance, subscribe. Your support keeps these stories coming.